If California was a country, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. It's the most populous state in the US with about 40.1 million people living in its borders. Decarbonizing a place this large is no small feat, and California's efforts to do so have been met with equal parts praise and criticism. How has California objectively been doing to decrease their environmental impact? That is the question that I am going to try to answer for you today. Hey y'all, it's Becky here from the Beckosphere, where we talk about climate news and solutions. If you would like to stay up to date with the latest climate information, please consider hitting that subscribe button below and ringing the bell so you don't miss every single time I post. As many who have watched my videos probably know, I live in California. I've lived in Northern and Central California my whole life, minus the 4 years I was in Oregon for college. Despite being a very climate conscious person, I'm embarrassed to say that I really haven't been doing that great of a job catching up with my state's climate record. So researching for this video has been a useful way to get more informed, just personally. Hey guys, Editing Becky here. I just want to say that you might notice some changes in the audio difference from like where I'm talking now to the video related audio, and that's just because through the editing process during the time that's taking to do this video, I am learning more and more new things that have come out and I want to share them. So those are just kind of post video recording editing things that I'm going to say, and I just wanted to let you know that that's why there's a change in audio quality. I'm using 2 different mics, so sorry ahead of time, but that's just a heads up. Let's start with some personal reasons as to why California should decarbonize. Basically, how climate change is expected to impact the state. I will also mention some adaptation strategies for each of these problems. The West is in the worst drought it's experienced in 1,200 years, and California got below average snowpack again. California actually experienced its worst January and February in history for drought. It'll be interesting to see if March also aligns with this trend. The California government is currently weighing the idea of potentially naming heat waves to emphasize their deadly nature. This lack of water supply cost California's agriculture industry $1.2 billion and over 8,700 jobs just last year. More farmers are relying now on groundwater, which harms the local ecosystem and costs more to use. They've been taking more groundwater than nature can replenish, so the state created a Groundwater Management Act, which formed local groundwater sustainability agencies tasked with creating plans to sustainably manage the groundwater supply by 2040. Unfortunately, a lot of local agency submissions were not realistic to the severity of the problem and were missing things, so that so far has not worked very great. Some farmers are considering putting excess water back in the groundwater system. It kind of works just as flooding different fields, recharging basins, wells, and other floodable sites by peeling off a little bit of the water from the state's waterways when there's an excess amount. And this kind of mimics California's historical pre-settlement water cycle, which therefore is a relatively sustainable way to do it. To try to reduce unnecessary water usage, last year Californian officials halted Nestle's ability to take millions of gallons of our water to sell it back to us in the form of bottled water, so that's good. In the beginning of this year, the state also set restrictions for watering lawns. The drought and heat is also exacerbating wildfires by drying out what vegetation grows from winter rains, yet can't be replenished by snowmelt in the hotter summers. The frequency of wildfires hasn't changed very much, but the amount of acreages burned per year has gone up a lot. California's Governor Gavin Newsom allocated $1.5 billion to wildfire prevention in September 2021. The state spends around $3 billion a year fighting these wildfires. The only thing is that we need to make sure that that money is used properly for prevention measures because it has been overstated in the past. The combination between wildfires and drought, as well as development and the use of pesticides in agriculture and all kinds of reasons. It has resulted in California losing a lot of its biodiversity. California itself is a pretty big biodiversity hub, and it has committed to 30% of federal lands and waters being conserved by 2030. It also does have more land under biodiversity protection than any of the other lower 48 states. One thing people can do to help this problem is to plant native plants in their front and backyard instead of the pesky lawn. No one likes lawns anymore. Those are like so 1960s. So by doing so, you could also help reduce water usage because native plants are more resilient to drought-stricken areas, and it encourages natural pollinators, as bees and other insects are some of the main species impacted by this biodiversity loss. And sea level rise is threatening coastal infrastructure, mainly in the San Francisco Bay Area. Okay, so that wasn't necessarily true. Sea level rise can also be a problem for Southern California. And one of the major issues is that many industrial sites that hold different chemicals, like different refineries, sewage treatment plants, power plants, legacy hazardous waste sites, Superfund sites, and cleanup sites, they are all at risk of sea level rise because they are literally right up against the coast. So that's another huge concern, and it's something that Southern California needs to figure out whether or not to increase their coastlines or to somehow disable or move those sites. The West Coast is much steeper than the East Coast, so we aren't as impacted by sea level rise, but the Bay Area still has to prepare. One idea being floated around is to take sediment dredged up from the nearby shipping channels and use it to restore wetlands around the perimeter of the bay. This could cost about $25 to $35 million, which is way less than building a seawall or making emergency fixes to infrastructure. So that was a bit about basically what we are experiencing here in California and some of the adaptation methods that we're trying to implement. I didn't go too much in depth on those because each of those adaptation methods, it could be a whole video on its own. So I'm trying to be relatively brief. Most of this video, we're going to talk about the mitigation strategies in the form of reducing carbon emissions in different sectors. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so let's start with the bigger picture elements and then look at each of the industry sectors' impacts. California committed to bold climate goals in 2006 called the Global Warming Solutions Act, or AB 32. The plan really got going in 2008, hence the big drop in emissions starting then. This includes one of the world's largest cap and trade programs, which accounts for 85% of emissions. It was launched in 2013. Many observers in the market call it a grand experiment, and it appears to be working for the most part. Cap and trade is when a government tells businesses how much they can emit and gives it to them in 1 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions allowances. So 1 metric ton is about the same as driving a gas-powered car about 2,500 miles. The government then creates a market allowing them to trade emissions amounts back and forth. By doing so, companies are incentivized to make money by reducing emissions. Over time, the government reduces how large of emissions allowances businesses get each year. This same technique was used in the US to drop sulfur dioxide emissions in the 90s, which is part of the Clean Air Act, and that's why we don't hear about acid rain as much as we used to. In 2021, one allowance in California costs $17 to $28. The program is responsible for 38% of the emissions drop since it launched, which is a pretty big impact. However, it's not a perfect system. Some environmental advocates are concerned about how many offsets are in the system. Offsets are projects businesses can purchase to make up for emissions, like capturing methane in coal plants or planting trees somewhere. It doesn't have to necessarily be in California. Some economists are concerned that companies have saved up so many allowances that the program isn't working properly. We're talking over 300 million allowances. There are methods the government is exploring to fix this, like taking away allowances that aren't used in a 24-hour period, but the California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance, a coalition of labor and business groups, worries that this move could disrupt the market's integrity of the program. The program is also set to end 40% in 2030, which is interesting. I'm not sure why. California has committed to reducing emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. In 2019, California was responsible for 418.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which basically means that they were accounting for all greenhouse gases, but it's measured in terms of carbon dioxide emissions. This is a bit below 2018 levels. These numbers do not account for emissions expelled during wildfires or land management outside of agriculture. Those emissions are counted in the natural and working lands ecosystem carbon inventory. It does include emissions from fossil fuel combustion, including combustion from power imported and consumed by the state, greenhouse gases created as a byproduct of chemical reactions in industrial processes, use of greenhouse gas containing consumer products and human-made chemicals, and emissions from agriculture and waste sector operations. For an even sooner goal, California committed to reducing emissions below 1990 levels by 2020, creating a maximum greenhouse gas emissions bar of 431 mmTCO2e. And so they try to stay under that 2020 greenhouse gas limit. They have successfully maintained levels below that limit since 2016. The state's emissions peaked in 2001. So it's good that they are going down. Greenhouse gas emissions per person in California dropped from 14 tons per person in 2001 to 10 tons per person in 2019. For comparison, the national average was 15 tons per person in 2019. The carbon intensity of the economy dropped 45% from 2000 to 2019, while the GDP increased by 63% in that time, down 4.1% while up 2.6% from 2018 to 2019. So now let's go through each of the sector's emissions, starting with California's largest emitting sector by far, which is transportation. Transportation emissions represent almost 40% of emissions in 2019. When emissions from extracting, refining, and moving transportation fuels in California are included, it accounts for over 50%. Transportation is sort of the second fastest decarbonizing sector behind energy, and I'll explain sort of in a sec. Transportation emissions have gone down in 2018 and 2019 due to an influx of renewable diesel and an increased percentage in biofuels. This accounts for 27% of total on-road diesel sold in California. Renewable diesel increased by 61% from 2018 to 2019. But if you look at the graph, it's questionable how much that increase in biofuels has actually helped to reduce emissions, because basically the emissions have just moved to other methods of emitting through the creation of that renewable diesel and biofuel. So that's why I say kind of, because like I'm skeptical about biofuel, and renewable diesel is an oxymoron. Now let's talk about the infamous gas prices. There's a lot that goes into why our gas prices are higher. California has a higher biofuel integration requirement than any other state through their low carbon fuel standards implemented in 2011, which is partially why our gas is so expensive. Regulatory programs to reduce greenhouse gases, along with taxes, account for $1.27 of the price according to the Western States Petroleum Association. 40% of that tax comes from the state's gas tax. The cap and trade program has increased prices at the pump because the state is trying to discourage fossil fuel companies from emitting so much, but fossil fuel companies are making the consumers pay for that tax. I guess then it's up to the observer to decide whether or not it's the fault of government regulations or fossil fuel companies for that number ending up in the pump. California also has the second highest taxes on gas after Pennsylvania. California has a lot of taxes and regulations in general, which can be seen as a good or bad thing depending on your position with like taxes and government intervention and all that good stuff. West Coast gas prices are also higher than the rest of the country because the Rocky Mountains block them from getting relief from other parts of the country, which could be why we're seeing super high gas prices right now with the Ukrainian crisis. California produces enough gas to meet 30% of its needs. The rest come from either Alaska or other countries such as Ecuador, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. Ecuador, that's interesting. I wonder if that impacts the Amazon at all. Let me go ahead and ask my fellow climate change YouTuber and friend, Ankar Shah. Hey Ankar!
Hey Becky.
So I'm doing a video on basically California's overall emissions, and I noticed that they're importing oil from Ecuador. Do you know how much oil they're importing from Ecuador and if that impacts the Amazon?
About 89% of the crude oil exported from the Amazon forest comes from the country of Ecuador. Now, 66% of this crude Amazonian oil goes to the US, mainly into California. Despite its progressive image and progressive leaders, new research shows that California consumes more oil from the Amazon than any other region in the world. While the state of California has policies to reduce domestic oil drilling, much of the fossil fuels received in the state are from places such as the Amazon, which are located outside of US borders. California converts 50% of the Amazon oil exported globally into fuel for airports such as the Los Angeles airport, distributors such as Amazon.com, trucking fleets of companies like PepsiCo, and retail giants like Costco. Marathon, Chevron, and Valero are the top 3 refiners of oil from the Amazon, and all of them are located in California. Chevron has spent nearly $2 billion fighting its court-ordered mandate to pay $9.5 billion in cleanup and community reparations costs that it is responsible for in Ecuador. So California's GDP is $3 trillion, which is the largest by US state and the 5th largest economy globally. Meanwhile, the country of Ecuador has a total GDP of $98 billion. That's 30 times less than that of California. So it's no surprise that the new president Guillermo Lasso wants to double oil drilling, because poor countries want to follow the path of wealth and prosperity that's laid out by rich countries like the US. Many indigenous tribes view the earth as their mother and oil as the blood of our planet. As early as 2000, Uwa and Sapara leaders from the Amazon have stated that pumping oil out of the ground would upset the cosmic balance and send the world spinning towards destruction. We now know this as a scientific fact, and they knew it based on their indigenous place-based wisdom.
Wow, that sounds like a really big problem. I'm glad you're working on a video for it. I definitely recommend to my viewers to go check it out. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Alright then, thank you so much. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Yeah, I'll talk to you later. Bye. Wow. Ugh, the Amazon thing seems bad, and I'm glad that Ankar's doing a video on just like the impact of the Ecuador oil trade and also the potential solutions coming out of Ecuador. I definitely recommend you checking out his video. California's Governor Newsom has pledged to phase out new sale of gas-powered cars by 2035, but for a bit there, it wasn't clear how much control Newsom had. Towards the end of his presidency, Donald Trump limited California's ability to control vehicle emission standards. When the Clean Air Act was passed in 1963, it allowed the EPA to set standards for air pollution from cars, and it made it so states couldn't make their own standards. However, at that point, California was way ahead of the rest of the country by making its own limits, since LA was drowning in smog by the late 1940s. So the Clean Air Act allowed California to pass its own emissions rule and allowed other states to follow California if its rules are stricter than the national laws. Generally, 12 states and Washington, D.C. follow what California does. The other states being Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Washington. Biden recently restored California's legal authority to set stringent emission standards. California's current rule requires cars to get 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. Those numbers come from a plan Barack Obama had made in 2012 that didn't go through. In 2019, the average was only 23.8 miles per gallon, so that's a big jump. Now, environmental groups in California are trying to press the governor to impose tougher rules to promote electric vehicles, something that so far has not been done too much past the initial agreement of stopping the sale of gas-powered cars by a certain point. Now let's look at California's progress with its EV charging network. Right now, the best place to own an EV in the country is California. Out of the US's 113,600 charging stations, 41,300 are located in California. California received nearly $384 million from the infrastructure bill to keep going on their EV charging network. Because passenger car transportation is the most emitting part of the transportation sector, the move towards EVs will definitely help reduce California's overall emissions. However, there have been a lot of missed public transportation opportunities. Public transit in California generally sucks. While the pandemic didn't help public transit worldwide, the number of people using public transit in California has been declining for years. In the San Francisco Bay Area, where I grew up, transportation ridership has dropped by 5.2% from 2016 to 2018, 2.4% for work commutes, and 10.2% for non-commute travel. This is despite the local economy booming. This is partially due to an influx of ride-hailing apps taking over the market, and even more so due to the regional housing crisis that's pushing more people into areas away from the city that aren't compatible with using public transportation. What's the point of driving or taking multiple buses to get to the train? I will also say that for me, I never really learned how to use public transportation growing up in the Bay Area. Granted, I lived in mountainous suburbs. If I wanted to take public transportation to get to school, I would have had to walk a mile to the nearest downtown and then take 3 buses spanning a 15-minute driving distance from that downtown to my school. It didn't make sense. Here in Monterey, there's a lovely bike path that I can use to get to work, and thankfully I'm within walking distance to most things that I need. But if I want to go to Petco on the other side of town, a 15-minute drive away, it would take me 40 minutes using 2 buses to get there. So basically our public transportation, again, is shit. Back to San Francisco Bay Area, once you get into town, the public transportation gets a bit better as there are many buses you can take in actual San Francisco. LA's public transportation still sucks even when you're in the heart of the city. Transit usership in Southern California dropped 25% in the last decade, with the metro losing 10% of its ridership from 2006 to 2015. A loss of users can result in a death spiral for public transportation systems and exacerbates inequalities amongst those who can afford to drive a car everywhere and those who can't. That, compounding with the growing housing inequality, paints a really ugly picture on who can benefit from a booming local economy and who can't. And I've been talking about California specifically, but this is a big problem found everywhere in the US. The US has a D- public transportation rating, with almost half of Americans having no access to public transit. Lack of access to public transportation is one of the biggest factors that keep families from accessing economic mobility over multiple generations. Bottom line, investing in good public transportation, not dumb projects like the California bullet train nonsense, has been a missed opportunity to bring down emissions in California's biggest emissions sector while improving equity. But it would involve the state, particularly the Bay Area and Los Angeles, to look the housing crisis in the eye, which I don't think they want to do. I thought I spilled, but I'm good. Sorry. Now let's look at the state's second most emissions heavy sector, which is industry. The industrial sector accounts for 21% of California's emissions. Emissions in this sector are primarily driven by fuel combustion from sources that include refineries, oil and gas extraction, cement plants, and a portion of cogeneration emissions attributed to thermal energy output. Process emissions, such as from clinker production in cement plants and hydrogen production for refinery use, also contribute significantly to the total emissions for this sector. Refineries and hydrogen production represents the largest individual source in the industrial sector, contributing 33% of the sector's total emissions. Refining and hydrogen production sector emissions decreased by 1 MMT CO2e in 2019. Hydrogen. I'm guessing it's blue, or gray, or black. Not green. Switching it to green hydrogen sounds like a pretty good way to reduce emissions in this sector. And refineries refer to petroleum refineries, so that's part of the crude oil process. Other fuel use, the second largest category, refers to emissions from the combustion of fuels used by sectors not specifically broken down. I wonder if this includes flaring, which is when gas is burned off during the process of oil extraction when fossil fuel companies don't want to keep it. It can release methane, a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, though it doesn't last in the atmosphere for as long. Cogen refers to the portion of cogeneration emissions attributed to the total thermal output of cogeneration. Cogeneration is the generation of electricity and other energy jointly, especially the utilization of the steam left over for electricity generation to produce heat. So basically it's just when there's two energy sources produced in tandem. Now to the California's third most emitting sector, which is energy. Energy accounts for 14% of emissions. It also is the fastest dropping sector in California. In 2018, California committed to its energy sector hitting net zero emissions by 2045, 50% by 2025, and 60% by 2030. Sector emissions dropped by almost 7% from 2018 to 2019 due to an increase in renewables and hydropower. There was a 46% increase in hydropower. The California Air Resources Board splits energy emissions into two categories: emissions made in the state and emissions made from imports. In-state emissions account for the most greenhouse gases overall, but imported emissions create the most emissions per output. And I think that makes sense because I think that most of the imported energy is fossil fuels compared to renewable energy. The largest percentage of in-state electricity generation comes from renewables and nuclear. 48% of California's energy comes from wind, community solar, rooftop solar, nuclear, small hydropower sources, and large hydropower sources, which is a dam that can produce more than 30 megawatts of power. In-state solar, both rooftop and commercial, is the fastest growing renewable energy. It grew 9% from 2018 to 2019 and has actually been doing quite well during the pandemic. But right now, California is reconsidering its subsidies for rooftop solar. The problem is that when someone adds solar to their rooftops, utility companies lose out on money because they have to pay the customer for the energy that their home is making. And as a result of basically losing that customer, they jack up the prices for everyone else so they can continue paying for repairs. Not that the California utility companies seem to be very good at making repairs anyways, even before rooftop solar really took off. But this can be an equity issue because solar adopters often skew wealthier and white, putting the pay increase on their neighbors who might not be able to afford it or who might be living in apartments where they can't even make that decision. Like me. Therefore, the National Resource Defense Council and many unions are for dropping subsidies. But to me, shouldn't that mean that we should up the subsidies so more people can afford it and find a way to incentivize multifamily housing to get solar? Like, shouldn't it just be more accessible, not less? Some environmental advocates, including the Sierra Club, argue that the fee for participating in the grid should be lowered for lower income houses so that we can transition in a more equitable way. Honestly, utility companies feel threatened by rooftop solar because it eats into their profits and reduces their control on the grid. So they lobby against any effort to increase accessibility to it. In my opinion, I think we should have rooftop solar and utility scale solar, and maybe companies will just have to be a little bit smaller. I really should do a whole other video on ways that we can modernize our grid for a more clean and resilient future. Let me know if you would find that interesting in the comment section below. I have so many video ideas. I'm slowly getting through them. Anyways, another interesting solar news point out of California recently is that the Turlock Irrigation District secured a $20 million grant to install a network of solar panels over water canals. This is really neat because if California puts solar panels over all of its canals, the reduction of evaporation could save the state 63 billion gallons of water annually while generating enough electricity to power a sixth of California. It wouldn't solve California's water problems, but it would provide a little bit of a relief. As proof of concept, the project will only cover 2 small canals near Modesto and provide power for 100,000 homes. It's expected to be completed in 2024. This isn't the first time this technique has been used, it's just the first time that's been used in the US. It's part of a larger concept called agrivoltaics, which is totally another video that I would love to do someday. Wind has remained about the same since 2013, though there are 2 possible offshore wind locations likely to be auctioned off by the federal government in the next year or so. One is off of Morro Bay, which is a bit south of Big Sur. The other would be up north off of Humboldt. Small hydropower sites have also remained about the same for their output since 2017, while larger hydropower sites have fluctuated quite a bit. As I've stated in previous videos, hydropower is a point of tension between environmental activists and climate activists because it does form a relatively consistent form of clean energy, but what clean means and what consistent means kind of varies, because the drought is making this form of energy less consistent, and it might be considered clean in that it doesn't produce carbon emissions up front, but the flooding of different areas into these man-made lakes can release the carbon dioxide and methane from the vegetation as it rots under the water. This depends, though, on how deep the lake is and how warm the area around the lake is. Furthermore, it might make a difference on whether or not we are choosing to make new hydropower facilities or we're just staying consistent with the damage that's already been done. Something that might impact the hydropower in the state is actually a huge removal of several dams along the Klamath River. The Klamath River spans from California up through Oregon, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission decided that it was time to allow the river to flow freely again. This is important because a lot of the fishing industry, particularly the salmon industry, has been heavily impacted by these dams, and it harms the local environment. Unusually, this is a decision that almost everyone agrees with. The local tribes agree with this, environmental activists agree with this, business people around the area agree. Now, this will take away 686,000 megawatts of power annually. So this is not the biggest detriment to the hydropower industry, but it is a big removal. But overall, I think it will probably benefit the local environment. As for nuclear, California has one nuclear plant left called the Diablo Canyon Power Plant located in San Luis Obispo, which powers about 10% of the state. It is scheduled to start being shut down in 2024, something that California climate advocates are very conflicted about. People have been protesting this plant since the 80s after a fault line was discovered underneath the foundation during its construction. The plant's owner, PG&E, responded by making plans to up its earthquake proofing, but their plans got mixed up, so the plant has some design errors. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission still insists that it would take a really big earthquake to do enough damage to cause a meltdown, but many residents and environmental groups have wanted that plant gone since it was opened. The state agreed after a climate advocate group called Friends of the Earth published a study showing that it was cheaper to make up for the plant's energy output through renewables than to refurbish it to last longer. Nuclear advocating environmental groups argue that the decommissioning of the plant will hurt the state's timeline to reach net zero emissions by 2045, and the energy will likely be made up for by fossil fuels, which is what happened when the Edison International power plant closed down in 2012. A study out of Stanford and MIT found that if recommissioned, Diablo Canyon could have a desalination plant added to it and have it start making green hydrogen while still producing low-cost energy for its customers, basically being even more utilized. So it can either be more utilized or decommissioned. And so far, California has chose it to be decommissioned. Now, before we look at what fossil fuels are being used in state, let's briefly talk about California's battery storage capacity. California is way ahead of the rest of the nation in battery storage at 1.39 gigawatts as of August 2021. Its battery storage capacity actually increased by 50% between the first and second quarter in 2021, so that number could be well higher than what I just said. The California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, wanted to get 2.5 gigawatts on the grid by the end of 2021. In July of 2021, Governor Newsom issued an emergency proclamation that created an expedited permitting process to drive long-scale battery storage additions by October 2022. The largest battery storage facility is actually only 30 minutes north of Monterey in Moss Landing. Owned by Vistra, the Moss Landing Energy Storage Facility has a total capacity of 400 megawatts, making it the largest of its kind in the world. I really want to visit it. I need to make that happen. All that being said, CAISO has also invested more in gas-fired energy, with projects averaging at 24% higher output in 2021 than in 2020. Gas is the most prominent form of fossil fuel energy in state, and California worked to procure 5 new 30-megawatt plants just last year. On the other hand, Newsom announced California would stop fracking by 2025. So we'll see what happens. Newsom also announced that the state would eventually end oil drilling by 2045, but he should consider doing that much sooner, since a new analysis by the Center for Biological Diversity found that California's oil fields are one of the most emissions-intensive operations in the world, even more than the infamous Canadian tar sands. That's really bad. California is the nation's 7th largest producer of crude oil and the 3rd largest oil refiner. In 2020, regulators issued more than 1,900 permits for new oil wells. Why the heck is California still issuing new permits? And California's oil is denser and more carbon intensive. Quote, heavy oils are especially climate damaging because they often require energy intensive techniques such as hydraulic fracturing, water flood, steam flood, and cyclic steam to extract. This greater energy demand results in greater greenhouse gas emissions as well as greater health and safety risks. The carbon intensity of crude oil in California oil fields has increased by 22% from 2012 to 2019, despite overall production dropping 20% in the same time period. Carbon intensity of oil imported in California went up by 8% during that same time period. Quote, so although the average carbon intensity of all oil refined in California is increasing, the average carbon intensity of California's produced oil is increasing far faster, twice the rate of all oils refined in California, and nearly 3 times the rate of oils originating outside of California. There's also enough methane leaking out of the processes to make California's oil worse of an environmental impact than coal. This is also a public health problem because 18% of Californians live within a mile of an oil or gas well, and these people are often low income and minority groups. Living near these sites increases a person's chance of cancer, respiratory illnesses, and pregnancy and birth complications. For a long time, California was the only state with no minimum setback distance between wells and public spaces. In October 2021, the state passed a new rule that would require new oil and gas wells to be built at least 3,200 feet away from communities, though that's still less than a mile away, and it doesn't undo all the wells that have already been built closer. The report basically said that we need to decrease our oil imports and in-state production in tandem. Quote, a 2018 study found that the decline in production that would result if California stopped approving new oil wells would be approximately equal to the decline in oil consumption forecast by the California Air Resources Board's scoping plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Ending the approval for new oil wells and accelerating the ongoing decline of the state's oil production would therefore not require an increase in imports. An update to the findings of the 2018 study using data from the 2020 CARB Commission study that charted 3 pathways for California carbon neutrality by 2045 strengthens this conclusion. Under CARB's balanced and zero carbon energy scenarios, the decline in California's oil demand between 2020 and 2030 would exceed the decline in oil production if the state stopped issuing permits for new oil wells. Thus, under California's current climate policies, California can and should simultaneously reduce in-state oil production and oil imports. Unfortunately, California actually received its first D from the California Environmental Voters, or Enviro Voters, since the scorecard was developed in 1973. They claim that California is currently at a low point in their environmental record. The group argues that California is not on track to meet its climate goals, especially because 63% of state legislators are taking oil money. Here are some environmentally friendly state legislators, and here are some environmentally unfriendly state legislators. This is not necessarily reflective of the governor himself, because the environmental scorecard for him actually has been about a B minus, which is definitely better than the state's record. It's still not clear how the state plans to transition workers in the fossil fuel industry to cleaner jobs. Overall, the energy sector is slowly decarbonizing faster than most states, but still not fast enough, and we still have a lot of problems. Now, this is all just in-state energy, which represents about 2/3 of the state's energy-related emissions. California imports basically every type of energy, but primarily fossil fuels, I think. I mean, the biggest category is unspecified, so that's not very helpful. Now, for the lovely rolling blackouts Californians have grown very accustomed to. Fossil fuel sympathizers are quick to blame them on an increase in renewables, but in reality, it's a combination between gas plants failing to operate, hydroelectric plants underperforming due to drought, and potentially mismanagement by grid operators. Diversification of energy supply, increased battery storage, and modernization of the grid to make it smarter and more self-healing can help reduce these blackouts. And then there's planned blackouts, which is where PG&E shuts off parts of the system for fear that their infrastructure will spark a fire during hot and windy conditions. This is where PG&E needs to hurry up with the grid updates already so they can stop being the problem. Less money towards how we can prepare for evacuation advertisements, and more money towards burying power lines or modernizing the grid. Us Californians, we really love PG&E. Okay, building standards, which can also help reduce blackouts when done well. The commercial and residential sector is the 4th largest emitting sector, and it actually went up in emissions a bit by 2019. Homes and businesses use 70% of California's electricity and are responsible for about 1/4 of the state's greenhouse gas emissions as of last year, according to the California Energy Commission, which is way higher a percentage than the California Air Resources Board, CARB, said in their 2019 report that I've been referencing. I'm not sure if it's grown significantly in 2 years or just the department's calculated it differently. I'm kind of thinking it's probably the latter. Most emissions from this space come from gas use in heating, cooking, hot water, and steam generation. And it's important to note that air conditioning and appliance operations emissions were calculated into the energy sector category, and we'll talk about emissions from refrigerant chemicals in a bit. So again, I think that's why those numbers were different, is that these CARB did not include refrigeration and HFCs into this, so that's probably why. Residential emissions account for the highest amount of emissions in this category, but when accounting for increased amounts of housing, emissions per residence has actually gone down, especially after 2013, which I think is due to California's implementation of the 2013 Green Building Standards Code, I think. That would be a really fast implementation, but I couldn't find any other reason why that would be. Commercial emissions compared to floor space added actually didn't go up much. Now in August 2021, the California Energy Commission adopted updated clean building standards, which encourage new buildings to use electric heat pump technology, establish electric-ready requirements, expand solar system and battery storage standards, and strengthen ventilation standards. Now on to the agriculture sector, which is the 5th largest emitting sector and has remained relatively stagnant since the year 2000. It accounted for 7.6% of California's emissions in 2019, mainly due to methane and nitric oxide emissions from livestock and poor agriculture practices. If land management is well done, it should take up carbon, not release it. It also shouldn't require as much chemical intervention. 71% of agriculture emissions come from livestock. Livestock-associated emissions have gone up 18% since the year 2000. A lot of it comes from manure management and animals burping and farting. A lot of it has to do with manure management, which really just makes me think, why don't we use that manure as natural fertilizer and solve 2 problems at once? Emissions drops in crop growing and harvesting have mainly gone down because the land use for that stuff has gone down. So it's just been it goes together. I don't have the stats to back up this part, but I can say from driving through California that a lot of our largest farming procedures are monoculture, which basically means that it's just rows and rows of that same plant. Salinas and Watsonville are 30 minutes to an hour north of Monterey, and they're very big agriculture operations, and they're just miles upon miles of plastic covered monocrop. Because 45% of California's agricultural fields are rented, it might be harder for farmers to implement longer term sustainable practices, but this topic is also for a whole other video. And then meanwhile in COP26, California was actually a representative for sustainable agriculture practices, so I'm just confused with that. Now on to the 6th largest emitting sector, high global warming potential, or GWP. This one's pretty short. Basically, refrigerants like hydrofluorocarbons are becoming more common as they replace ozone depleting substances, so that's why this category is growing in emissions. This is a problem for every form of refrigeration, but mainly for commercial and transportation sectors. The last emissions category is waste and recycling. Most of emissions in this category come from methane and nitric oxide emitted from landfills. Though it's only responsible for 2% of California's emissions, emissions from landfills have increased by 20% since the year 2000. Industrial composting systems help reduce these emissions because they properly turn food waste into the soil in a way that keeps emissions in the soil. California started a new composting law this year where you're supposed to throw your food scraps into yard waste. But me being in an apartment, I don't have access to a yard waste container, so this is not helpful to me. But if you have a yard waste container, please put your composting in there and look up what should be composted and what shouldn't. For example, don't compost meat. That's not possible. So basically for me, living in an apartment, I keep my compost in a freezer and then I give it to a local farmer at the farmer's market. Wow, okay, we finally made it to the end. As you can see, there's a lot of areas where California is ahead of the curve, but there's also a lot of room for improvement. I didn't even have time to talk about how California is responsible for a third of the US plastic that makes its way to third world countries, or how the state recently created its first plan in the country to tackle microplastics. There's a little con-pro thing for you with plastic. This was just basically a general overview of what the state looks like right now, but each county and city has its own climate challenges and goals. If you live in California, I highly recommend that you look up what adaptation and mitigation measures are being implemented in your city or county and tell us what you found in the comment section below. I plan to do that for Monterey. So there will be a pinned comment down below talking about Monterey's sustainability. With globalized news, we often forget to look at what's going on locally, but community-based action can be the most impactful way to make a meaningful difference. So don't take that for granted. Also, let me know which state you'd like me to look at next. I think I'm going to make this an infrequent series on the channel because there's many other things I want to talk about, and these types of videos are very long and research intensive. I know I've already gotten a vote for Washington State. Until next time, remember to talk about the climate crisis every single day and to support your local news organizations. Thank you again to Ankar Shah for partnering with me on this video, and be sure to check out his channel, which is linked below. Thank you to the people on Patreon who helped me pay for my equipment and the many news subscriptions that make climate recaps possible.
A special shout out to the Climate Confident and Courageous members David H., Norman Anal, Greg H., Paul B., Phil Plasma, and now Holly M. Thank you so much for your support.
If you would like to monetarily support the work I do, please check out the Patreon and buy me a coffee, links in the description box below. All right, I'll see you all later. Bye.